Hey everyone! I started a series on the Dewey Decimal Classification System a while back. The playlist can be found below. There will be at least 11 videos in this series before I'm done, maybe more, and I've done an introduction to the 10 major divisions of the classification system, and I covered the first of the divisions, general knowledge, in another video. Today we're going to cover the second of the 10 major divisions, the 100s, philosophy and psychology. Philosophy and psychology books started out as a fairly large division in the Dewey Decimal Classification System. In the mid-19th century, when it was begun by Melville Dewey, philosophy was still a very large and well-respected field of study. In fact, of the two subjects in this division, psychology was still in its infancy, and so it only got one subdivision, the 150s. Here's a chart of all the subdivisions in the 100s, and here's the 150s. At this point, the books in the 150s usually far outnumber the books in all the other subdivisions put together. I may do an entire video on just the 150s at some point in the future. I took a trip last week to the local branch of my public library system. The nonfiction books in that library, like in many public libraries, has been shrinking lately because so much of the information can be found on the internet and the demand for fiction is so much higher. But I still managed to get at least one book from all but 10 of the subdivisions in this division. So here's the first book I got. It's from 100 through 109, which are the philosophy, parapsychology, and occultism and psychology books. And yes, you saw that correctly. Parapsychology and occultism also go in this section. I guess they leave it out of the division name because relatively few books are devoted to that. But like psychology, it does have its own subdivision, the 130s. But as in all the divisions, this first subdivision, 100 through 109, covers theories, miscellaneous books, dictionaries, encyclopedias, organizations, research, histories, collective biographies, just the general stuff that pertain to the three subjects listed in the subdivision name. The book I checked out from this subdivision is an oldie but goodie. It's The Story of Philosophy, The Lives and Opinions of the World's Greatest Philosophers from Plato to John Dewey by Will Durant. This book was first published in 1926 and last updated in 1961. So even though it's obviously out of date, it would still be a good place to start for anyone interested in philosophy. You may have heard of Will Durant in the past. He and his wife, Ariel, wrote many well-respected histories of Western civilization. In fact, he dedicates this book to his wife. I'm going to read you the dedication because it's really sweet, kind of poetic. To my wife, grow strong, my comrade, that you may stand unshaken when I fall, that I may know the shattered fragments of my song will come at last to the finer melody in you, that I may tell my heart that you begin where passing I leave off and fathom more. That's really sweet. And I'm going to read you the first couple of sentences from his To the Reader section. This book is not a complete history of philosophy. It's an attempt to humanize knowledge by centering the story of speculative thought around certain dominant personalities. And he goes on there from there to explain exactly why he did the book the way he did it. It's an introduction to Western philosophy by a well-respected scholar. And just what little I read of it has me thinking that it may be easier to read than how to read a book. The second subdivision is 111 through 119, and that's metaphysics. So what is metaphysics? Well, according to the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, it is, and I'm just going to read this, a division of philosophy that is concerned with the fundamental nature of reality and being. That's a pretty big topic. And that includes ontology, cosmology, and often epistemology. This is the one section that my library had no book on. They may have had some that were checked out. I just don't know. The third subdivision is epistemology, causation, and humankind, also pretty big topics. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge, and of course causation just means what initially caused things to be the way they are. I'll mention here that Durant in the last book didn't seem to think very highly of epistemology, but I think many of us find these topics fascinating. I know I do. The book I got from this subdivision is Ignorance. Everything You Need to Know About Not Knowing by Robert Grafe. According to the back jacket, Grafe is a retired journalist, school teacher, and businessman. His writing reminds me a bit of Wendell Berry. He's intelligent, has a lot of common sense, and he does not mind stepping on toes. I was so taken with the introduction to this book that I'm now well over halfway through done reading it. I had to interrupt my other reading schedule to read this. It's just one of those books that beg to be read, and it's riveting reading for me. If you don't mind having your opinions and your worldview challenged, I recommend this book. The oddball section here is the 130s. Parapsychology and occultism. And I'm not trying to be ugly or funny when I say that. I find these topics completely fascinating, but they're definitely outside the mainstream, and if you bring them up in polite conversation, many people will give you the stink eye, and some will act embarrassed for you. But regardless, it's nice to know that the public library has room for all sorts of interests for all sorts of people. I think that's what makes them great. For this section, I checked out The Complete Illustrated Guide to Tarot, How to Unlock the Secrets of the Tarot by Rachel Pollack. My library had this book and quite a few more books on witchcraft, demonology, ghosts, haunting, dreams, and things like that. So, okay, back to the more mainstream books. The fifth section is the 140s, Specific Philosophical Schools. By this they mean idealism, intuitionism, humanism, sensationalism, naturalism, pantheism, dogmatism, and isms of all other philosophical stripes. The book I checked out was about existentialism. It is At the Existentialist Café, Freedom, Being, and Apricot Cocktails by Sarah Bakewell. Bakewell is a well-respected British writer who has written several highly lauded books, including How to Live, A Life of Montaigne. The existentialists began their inquiries in the interwar period of the 1920s and 30s, mostly in Europe, and continued until the 1950s. They had a huge influence on societal changes in the 1960s and beyond. In fact, it seemed that inroads they had made for civil rights and liberties were nearing attainment, and they went out of fashion around the end of the 20th century. But with the increased interest in fascist movements, their message seems once again very relevant. Some of them were Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, the novelist Albert Camus, Martin Heidegger, and Karl Jaspers, and others. Many of them knew one another personally, and they often had interactions and conversations in places like, well, Paris cafes. Bakewell tells what was happening during their lives, the Nazis being a primary focal point for many of them, and she tells how the events around them shaped their ideas and their works. The sixth subdivision is psychology. As I mentioned earlier, this one has expanded to take over most of the real estate in the philosophy and psychology division. And I will likely do an entire video just on psychology at a later date. But for now, the book I chose to check out was A Whack on the Side of the Head, How You Can Be More Creative by Roger von Eyck. And I'm probably mispronouncing his name. I apologize to Mr. von Eyck. He held a PhD from Stanford and worked with IBM before he started a creative consulting company called Creative Think in 1977. This book was first published in 1983, and it's considered a classic in the field. Most of these ideas are based on his version of thinking outside the box. He felt the way we had been trained to think is what stifles our creativity, and I think that makes a lot of sense. He advises things like ignoring logic, breaking rules, spending time in play, being silly, and making mistakes. He says everyone is creative if they'll just allow themselves to be. I checked this book out thinking I would read it, but then I got involved in ignorance and it was all over for me. But I'll still probably read this one. Okay, from ignoring logic to being logical, the next subdivision is the 160s, Philosophical Logic. I know nothing about this. The book I checked out is The Art of Logic in an Illogical World by Eugenia Chang. Chang is a mathematician who believes that the world would be a better place if people could learn to think logically. And I don't think she's wrong, although I'm not very good at it. The world, she says in the introduction, is not black and white. It's varying shades of gray with all the other colors and all their various hues thrown in. And I like that. She shows how logic can be used to determine what makes the most sense in arguments that happen all the time, like over racism, healthcare, harassment, and privilege. It sounds like a really good book, and I may read it one day. I like the idea of her approach. Just showing me how logic works doesn't mean a lot to me. But if it affects how my life is run, I find that intriguing. The next subdivision is the 170s, ethics, or moral philosophy. The book I got for this section is Being Good, A Short Introduction to Ethics by Simone Blackburn. This book was originally published as one of the Oxford University Press's very short introduction series, and it was published in 2001. British philosophy professor Simone Blackburn starts from the premise that we are living in a scientific and material world where religion no longer speaks to the masses. In a world like this, where humans are considered no better than other animals and philosophies like relativism, nihilism, and skepticism seem to be the dominant ideas in thought, do ethics and morals still have a place, or are they just quaint ideas that are no longer necessary? Well, things have changed a lot in the 22 years since this book was published. He argues that we need to value ourselves and others to make life meaningful, or at least that's what I got out of the cursory reading of the book. I believe he comes down on the side of ethics, and that's a relief to me. He starts with our defenses against ethics, and we all do have them. Most people don't like being told what to do. But then he looks at the problems we're all likely to encounter in life, and then having established that we, yes, indeed, do need ethics, he looks at the foundations of ethical thought. It sounds like a good book to read, and I may read it one day when my life slows down. I don't need to be convinced that we need ethics. I've always been a big fan. The 9th subdivision is the 180s, Ancient, Medieval, and Eastern Philosophy. Our library only had one book from this subdivision, but it's a good one. And I read it all the way through decades ago. Many of you have heard of it. It's Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. On the off chance that you've never heard of Marcus Aurelius, he was an emperor of Rome, and he lived from 121 to 180 AD or CE, whichever you prefer. In this book, he writes his thoughts about life and what it takes to live a good one. He was an adherent of Stoicism. They believed that one must think about life, stay tranquil, and contribute to the common good. That's just a broad overview, of course. I'm not a Stoic, but I do find it an admirable philosophy. The book itself is extremely easy to read, as I said. I've never been a fan of most philosophy books because of the specialized vocabulary and the denseness of their arguments, but this one was a breeze to read, and I'm just going to read you 2 points that he made. Okay, here's one thought. All things are in process of change. You yourself are ceaselessly undergoing transformation and the decay of some of your parts, and so is the whole universe. Everything's winding down, folks. And the last one is, and I love this, leave another's wrongdoings where it lies. I think that says enough right there, and I think that's very wise advice. And finally, the last subdivision is 190, Modern Western Philosophy, which is odd. My library had two books to choose from here, and the one I chose is The History of Philosophy by A.C. Grayling. And unlike the first history I got from 109 that was written by Will Durant, this one covers the history of both Eastern and Western philosophy, which is odd considering that the title of the subdivision is Western philosophy specifically, but that's okay. This still looks like a good book. And they're not kidding when they say this covers everything. It really covers everything. He starts with the pre-Socratics, goes through the modern West up to Derrida, and then he goes through Indian, Chinese, Arabic, Persian, and African philosophy. A.C. Grayling is an Oxford scholar who has written and edited over 30 books of philosophy. He clearly knows the subject, and you're in good hands with him. So that's it for today. I hope I've encouraged you to head to your local public library and check out the philosophy and psychology section. You may be amazed at what you find there. For more excellent nonfiction books to read, check out my 2 books, Library Lens' curated collection of superlative nonfiction, and Library Lens biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs. And until next time, happy reading.